Billionaire CEO froze when a homeless young woman wore his ex-wife's necklace from 15 years ago. Security dragged her by the arm across the marble lobby of Alade Towers, her bare feet scraping against the polished floor, a small crowd of employees pausing mid-stride to watch. "Please," Nancy said, not fighting, not crying, just tired in a way that went bone deep. "I just need 2 minutes with him. 2 minutes." "You need to leave, madam," the security guard said, tightening his grip. "This is not a shelter." That was when the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open, and Oluwasegun Alade stepped out. The kind of man whose photograph appeared in business magazines more often than his own family saw his face, trailed by 2 assistants scrolling through his schedule for the day. He didn't even glance at the commotion at first. Men like him had learned, years ago, not to look. But something caught the light near the woman's collarbone, and Oluwasegun's steps slowed, then stopped completely, in the middle of his own lobby, in front of 40 employees who had never once seen him stop for anything. "Sir?" one of his assistants said. Oluwasegun didn't answer. He was staring at a thin, gold necklace hanging around the neck of a homeless young woman being dragged toward the door. A necklace with a single, unmistakable emerald pendant, custom-made by a jeweler in Victoria Island who had closed his shop 15 years ago. A necklace Oluwasegun himself had clasped around his wife's neck the night before she disappeared from his life forever. "Wait," he said quietly, then louder, his voice cracking through the lobby like a gunshot. "Wait, let her go." The guard froze. Nancy turned around and for the first time looked directly at the man whose empire she'd just spent an hour trying to get inside of. "Where?" Oluwasegun asked, his voice unsteady for the first time in 20 years. "Did you get that necklace?" Nancy didn't flinch. "From your ex-wife, right before she died." "Thank you for tuning in tonight. Where are you watching from? I would like to connect with you better. Like and subscribe. If you've ever felt the ground shift under a truth you spent years avoiding, hit subscribe. Because tonight, we find out what happens when one buried lie finally has nowhere left to hide. 15 years earlier, Oluwasegun Alade had everything a man in Lagos could want. A family shipping and logistics empire inherited from his father, a name that opened doors before he even knocked, and a wife named Adora, who had walked into his life at 23 with nothing but a business degree from the University of Lagos and a quiet, unshakable sense of her own worth. They'd met at a shareholders' dinner, of all places. Adora there as a junior analyst representing a smaller logistics partner, Oluwasegun there as the heir. Everyone in the room was quietly studying. She'd corrected one of his father's board members on a shipping tariff calculation, politely but without apology, in front of the entire table. "Most people in this room are too afraid to be right in front of my father," Oluwasegun told her afterward, half amused, half intrigued. "Most people," Adora replied, "haven't done the math themselves." He married her 11 months later against the quiet disapproval of his mother, who thought he could have chosen someone with a family name attached to hers. Oluwasegun didn't care. For the first 3 years of their marriage, he would later admit to almost no one, they were the happiest years of his adult life. He gave her the necklace on their 3rd anniversary, a single emerald pendant, custom-made by a jeweler in Victoria Island, the stone chosen to match the exact shade of green in the Ankara dress she'd worn the night they met. "So you'll always have something of us with you," he told her, clasping it around her neck, "even on the days I can't be." He had no idea, standing there in their bedroom that night, how soon those words would turn into something closer to prophecy than romance. The Alade family business, beneath its polished shipping contracts and glossy annual reports, had quietly built a second, uglier reputation. One Adora discovered almost by accident, 18 months into the marriage, while reviewing compensation files for a warehouse relocation project in Apapa. Dozens of dock workers and their families, she found, had been forcibly evicted from company housing to make way for a new terminal expansion. Evicted with promises of compensation that had been quietly falsified in the company's own records. The actual payouts diverted through a shell account that traced back, uncomfortably, to Oluwasegun's own uncle, who sat on the board and managed the family's special projects fund. "You need to see this," Adora told her husband one night, spreading the documents across his desk, her voice tight with the particular anger of someone who had trusted an institution and found rot underneath. "Families lost their homes, Oluwasegun, children, and somebody in your family took the money that was supposed to make it right." Oluwasegun studied the papers for a long time, his jaw tightening. "Let me look into it properly before we do anything. If this is true, it needs to be handled carefully, quietly. My uncle has allies on the board. If we move wrong, we could lose control of the company entirely." "Quietly," Adora repeated, something cold entering her voice. "Oluwasegun, there are families sleeping in relatives' parlors right now because of this." "I hear you. I'm asking for time, not forever. Just enough to do this the right way, without burning down everything my father built." Adora agreed, reluctantly, to wait. It was a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. Not because she was wrong to trust him, but because of what happened next, and how completely it was twisted against her. Within 3 months, the documents Adora had gathered disappeared from the company's internal servers. In their place, a new set of records surfaced, records showing, falsely, that Adora herself had been the one manipulating the compensation accounts, funneling money through an account that, on paper, now bore traces of her own signature, forged with a precision that could only have come from someone with intimate access to both the company's systems and Adora's own handwriting. Oluwasegun's uncle brought the falsified records to him personally, his face arranged into an expression of reluctant, sorrowful duty. "I didn't want to believe it either," he said. "But the evidence is what it is, Segun. She's been stealing from displaced families and using you as cover the entire time." "That's not possible," Oluwasegun said. But even as he said it, doubt had already begun working its way into his voice. "I know this is difficult, but ask yourself, how did a junior analyst with no family money end up with detailed knowledge of exactly which accounts to manipulate, that unless she'd been planning this from the very beginning?" That night, Oluwasegun confronted his wife with documents that named her as a thief, the very corruption she had discovered and tried to expose now rewritten seamlessly into her own crime. "I didn't do this," Adora said, her voice steady even as her hands shook. "Oluwasegun, look at me. I brought this to you. Why would I steal from the same families I was trying to help?" "Then explain the signatures." "I can't explain a lie I didn't tell." He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman he'd clasped an emerald necklace around 18 months earlier, at the certainty in her eyes that matched exactly the certainty she'd worn the night she corrected a board member over dinner, and chose, in the end, to believe his own family's blood over his wife's word. "I want you gone by the end of the week," he said quietly. "Take whatever you need. Just go." Adora didn't beg. She didn't cry in front of him. Not once. She packed 2 suitcases, left her wedding ring on the dresser, and walked out of Alade Towers for what both of them assumed, at the time, would be the last time either of them ever saw the other. She kept the necklace. It was the only thing of his she took with her. 15 years is a long time to build a wall around a single mistake, and Oluwasegun had used every one of those years well. He never spoke Adora's name again, not to his mother, not to his second wife, a woman named Folasade, whom he'd married 4 years after the divorce, for reasons that had far more to do with merger politics between 2 shipping families than with love. He buried the compensation scandal so deeply that even the internal auditors who'd once flagged irregularities in the Apapa relocation project eventually stopped asking questions, quietly reassigned or paid to forget. His uncle, rewarded for his loyalty during the crisis, rose to vice chairman of the board. The Alade empire grew. Alade Towers rose 42 stories over Victoria Island. Oluwasegun's face appeared on the cover of a business magazine with the headline, "Lagos's Most Disciplined CEO." And somewhere beneath all of it, quietly, permanently, sat a lie so old it had calcified into something almost indistinguishable from truth. He told himself, on the rare nights he allowed himself to think about it at all, that he'd made the only decision a reasonable man could have made with the evidence in front of him. He never let himself ask why he hadn't looked harder. Adora, meanwhile, had rebuilt a life in Port Harcourt, working under a different surname, taking small compliance and audit contracts for logistics firms far smaller than the one that had once been her whole world. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about the Alade name, never sold her story, never once tried to clear her own reputation. Not because she'd forgiven what had happened, but because she understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how much power the Alade family had to bury a story it didn't like. What she did do, quietly, over the following decade, was keep working. She rebuilt her own copies of the falsified records from memory and old drafts saved to a personal email account the company had never thought to check. She tracked down 2 of the displaced families from the original Apapa evictions, now scattered across Lagos, and helped them anonymously file freedom of information requests that chipped away, slowly, at the wall the Alade family had built. She was patient in the way only someone who has already lost everything can afford to be. And in her final years, sick with an illness she'd told almost no one about, she made one decision that would outlive her by more than a decade. She trained a young woman she'd taken in almost by accident, a girl named Nancy. Orphaned young, working odd jobs to survive, sharp enough to understand exactly what she was being taught, even when she didn't yet understand why it mattered. "If anything happens to me," Adora told her in the small flat they shared in her final year, "there's a folder. Everything is in there. The real records, the forged ones, names, dates, the account numbers my husband's uncle used to move the money. You take it to him yourself. Not the police first. Not a journalist first. Him. Let him see it with his own eyes before the world does." "Why him?" Nancy asked. "Why not just expose it?" "Because," Adora said quietly, "I want him to have the chance I never got. The chance to actually look, instead of choosing the version of the truth that was easiest to live with." She gave Nancy the necklace 2 weeks before she died. "Wear it when you go to him," she said. "He'll recognize it before he recognizes anything else about you." Some men only stop long enough to listen when the past is standing right in front of them, impossible to walk past. Adora died on a quiet Tuesday in a government hospital in Port Harcourt, with Nancy holding her hand and a folder of evidence hidden inside a plastic bag beneath the bed. What Adora hadn't accounted for, what nobody could have fully prepared Nancy for, was how hard the world would be to survive without her. Nancy lost the small room they'd shared within 2 months, unable to cover rent alone on odd cleaning jobs. She lost the cleaning jobs themselves when a client accused her falsely of theft, an accusation that followed her from one part of Lagos to another, closing doors everywhere she tried to open them. Within a year of Adora's death, Nancy was sleeping in bus parks, in church compounds, in the backs of restaurants that let her stay in exchange for washing plates until closing. She sold nearly everything she owned to survive. She never sold the necklace. She told herself, some nights, curled up in whatever corner of Lagos, would let her sleep undisturbed, that she was protecting evidence. Other nights, more honestly, she admitted to herself that The necklace had simply become the only thing she owned that had ever been given to her with love. And she wasn't ready to let go of that either. It took her nearly 2 years to work up the courage and scrape together enough bus fare to make her way to Alade Towers. The first time she tried, security turned her away at the gate without a word reaching anyone inside. The second time, she made it as far as the reception desk before being escorted out, the folder still safely hidden in her bag, untouched. The third time, she decided, would be different. Not because she had a better plan, but because she'd run out of anywhere else to go, and out of time to be patient about it. She wore the necklace deliberately that morning, tucking it just beneath the collar of her only clean shirt, and walked into the lobby of Alade Towers with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to be turned away to. "I need to speak to Mr. Alade," she told the receptionist, her voice steady despite the exhaustion behind it. "Tell him it's about his ex-wife." The receptionist didn't even look up. Security. And that was how Nancy found herself, minutes later, being dragged by the arm across a marble lobby in front of 40 strangers, until the necklace at her collarbone caught the light, and the most powerful man in the room forgot, for the first time in 15 years, how to keep walking past the truth. "Sit," Oluwasegun said, and the single word carried through the lobby with enough force that his own assistants flinched. He led Nancy, still barefoot, still trembling faintly with exhaustion rather than fear, not to a security office, but into a private conference room on the ground floor, waving off the 2 guards who tried to follow. Falsified, alerted by a call from one of the assistants, arrived within the hour, her expression tight with a confusion that would soon curdle into something closer to alarm. "Oluwasegun, who is this woman? Why is she?" "Not now, Fola." He hadn't taken his eyes off Nancy since they'd sat down. "Where did you get that necklace? I need you to say it again slowly." "From Adora," Nancy repeated. "She raised me the last few years of her life. She died 2 years ago, in Port Harcourt." Something in Oluwasegun's chest tightened at the word died, an emotion he didn't have time to examine before Nancy continued. "She told me to bring you something before I ever tried to tell anyone else. She said you deserved the chance to look at it yourself first." She reached into the worn bag she'd carried through 3 failed attempts to enter this building, and placed a thick, careworn folder on the polished conference table. Pages soft at the corners from years of handling, some photocopied, some handwritten, some printed on paper that had clearly been reprinted more than once as the ink faded. "What is this?" Oluwasegun asked, reaching for it. "Don't," Oluwasegun said quietly, and pulled it toward himself instead. He read for nearly 40 minutes in complete silence, while Nancy sat across from him, and Oluwasegun paced near the window, and his uncle, summoned reluctantly by a nervous assistant who didn't know what else to do, waited in the hallway outside, not yet aware of exactly what was spread across that table. The folder contained everything Adora had rebuilt from memory and old drafts, the original compensation records for the Apapa relocation, showing the true, unaltered payout amounts to displaced dock workers. Beside them, the falsified versions that had eventually replaced them in the company's official files, the same records that had once been used to accuse Adora of theft. And beneath both, something Oluwasegun hadn't seen before, a set of internal transfer records showing the exact account numbers used to divert the compensation funds, each one traceable through 2 shell companies to an account his uncle had opened 4 months before the discovery of Adora's supposed guilt. There was also, tucked near the back, a single page in handwriting Oluwasegun recognized immediately. Small, precise, unmistakably Adora's. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you finally have the chance to see what I tried to show you 15 years ago. I don't know if you'll believe it now any more than you believed me then. But I owed it to those families to make sure the truth outlived both of us. and I owed it to myself to stop carrying a lie that was never mine. I forgave you a long time ago, Oluwasegun. Not because what you did was small, but because carrying anger for 15 years is its own kind of prison, and I refused to die inside one. I hope, for your sake, you find a way out of yours too. Take care of the girl who brought you this. She has nothing left, and she gave up 2 years of her life making sure I kept my promise to those families. Don't let that be for nothing. Adora Oluwasegun set the letter down very carefully, as though it might tear if he held it too hard, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Segun. His uncle's voice from the doorway now, carrying the same practiced concern it had carried 15 years earlier. What's going on? Who let this woman into the building? Oluwasegun looked up slowly. Uncle Bio, come in, sit down. Something in his tone made his uncle hesitate in the doorway. I have some questions, Oluwasegun continued, about an account opened 4 months before Adora was accused of fraud. An account that appears, according to these records, to be yours. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for Oluwasegun to watch his uncle's face perform the exact same practiced arrangement of reluctant, sorrowful duty it had performed 15 years earlier, and long enough for Oluwasegun, for the first time, to actually see it for what it was. Segun, you can't possibly believe some homeless woman's forged documents over. I haven't accused you of anything yet, Oluwasegun said quietly. I only asked a question. The fact that you're already defending yourself against an accusation nobody made tells me something I should have paid attention to 15 years ago. His uncle's expression shifted, the concern draining out of it, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Be very careful, Segun. This company survives on stability, on the board's confidence. Digging up a 15-year-old scandal over the word of a street girl and a dead woman's letter could cost you everything your father built. My father, Oluwasegun said, standing slowly, built a company on his name, meaning something. You've spent 15 years teaching me that it doesn't have to. Folasade, still standing near the window, finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Oluwasegun, if any of this is true, if you sent that woman away for something she never did, what does that make the last 15 years of everything you've told yourself? He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he turned to Bansi, who had sat through the entire exchange with the same steady, exhausted patience Adora herself had once carried into rooms far more hostile than this one. You could have taken this to a journalist, he said. Sold the story, destroyed me publicly, the way you'd have had every right to do. Adora didn't raise me to destroy people, Nancy said simply. She raised me to finish what she started. There's a difference. Oluwasegun looked at the folder, at the letter, at the woman across the table who had survived 2 years on the street, rather than sell the one truth she'd been trusted to carry, and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives 15 years too late, exactly which version of the truth he had chosen all those years ago, because it was easier to live with than the alternative. Uncle Bio, he said quietly, not looking away from Nancy, you're going to want to call your lawyer. And Fola, someone get this young woman a proper meal, a place to stay tonight, and whatever she needs. She's not leaving this building the way she came in. The board meeting Oluwasegun called 3 weeks later was, by every account that later circulated through Lagos's business circles, unlike any in the company's history. He had spent those 3 weeks doing what he should have done 15 years earlier, not defending a decision already made, but actually investigating. He hired an independent forensic auditor, a woman with no ties to the Alade family or its board, and gave her full access to every account, every archive, every piece of paper Adora had gathered, and every piece his uncle had buried. He tracked down 2 of the original displaced families from the Apapa evictions himself, sitting in their modest homes in person, listening to stories he'd spent 15 years successfully avoiding. What the audit confirmed, methodically and without any room for the kind of doubt his uncle had once weaponized so effectively, was everything Adora's folder had already shown. The compensation funds diverted, the falsified records, the forged signatures traced conclusively to a source connected to his uncle's own office, and, buried in an old internal memo his uncle had apparently forgotten still existed, an explicit instruction to resolve the Adora situation before the board audit in Q3, dated 4 days before the forged documents first surfaced. There had never been an accident. There had never even really been a lie constructed carefully enough to survive real scrutiny. There had only been a nephew too eager to believe family loyalty over his wife's word, and an uncle who had understood, correctly, exactly how easy that would be to exploit. "Before this board votes on anything," Oluwasegun said, standing at the head of the table where his father had once sat, "I want to be clear about something. 15 years ago, I destroyed my wife's life and my own marriage based on evidence I never independently verified, because verifying it would have meant questioning my own family. That failure belongs to me, not just to the man who orchestrated it." Murmurs moved around the table. His uncle, seated near the far end, said nothing. His earlier confidence long since evaporated under 3 weeks of forensic scrutiny he'd had no way to outmaneuver. "Bio Alade," Oluwasegun continued, "is removed from this board, effective immediately, pending formal criminal referral for fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of company funds. I'll be personally overseeing restitution to every family affected by the Apapa relocation, full compensation, with interest, backdated 15 years. Segun, think about what this does to the company's reputation." A board member started. "The company's reputation," Oluwasegun said, "survived 15 years built on a lie. I'd like to see what it looks like built on the truth instead." His uncle rose from his chair, opened his mouth as if to argue one final time, seemed to measure the room, and found no allies left in it. He left the boardroom without another word, and within the month, formal charges had been filed. The scandal that had once been powerful enough to end a marriage now, finally, ending the career of the man who'd engineered it. The story broke publicly 2 weeks later, not through a journalist Nancy had gone to, and not through any leak from inside the company, but through Oluwasegun himself. In a statement he insisted on writing personally, rather than leaving to his communications team. 15 years ago, I chose to believe a lie because it was easier than confronting the truth about my own family. My ex-wife, Adora, paid for that choice with her reputation, her marriage, and years of a life she did not deserve to lose. She never stopped trying to make things right, even after everything that was taken from her. This statement and the restitution that follows it is 15 years overdue. It does not undo what was done to her. It is simply, finally, the truth. The business press seized on it immediately. Lagos's most disciplined CEO, the same magazine that had once profiled him, now running a very different headline, "The 15-year lie behind Alade Towers." But underneath the scandal coverage, something else circulated too. Quieter, but no less powerful. The story of a homeless young woman who'd spent 2 years surviving the streets of Lagos rather than sell out a promise to a dying woman who trusted her. Nancy did not ask for money, though Oluwasegun offered it, enough in fact to change her life entirely several times over. What she asked for instead, when he finally sat down with her privately to ask what she actually wanted, surprised him. "A job," she said. "A real one. Adora taught me how to read financial records well enough to catch a 15-year-old fraud. I don't want charity. I want to use that." Oluwasegun studied her for a long moment. The same steady clarity in her eyes that he remembered, faintly, aching, from a woman he'd once clasped a necklace around all those years ago. The compliance department, he said finally, is going to need someone thorough, someone who can't be talked out of what the numbers actually say. I can do that. I believe you, he said. And this time, unlike 15 years earlier, he meant it the way it was supposed he meant, earned, not assumed. Nancy started in the compliance department 3 weeks after the board meeting, in a small office 2 floors below Oluwasegun's, with a desk, a working laptop, and, for the first time in over 2 years, a key to a door that locked behind her at night. She was good at the work. Better than good. Within her first 6 months, she flagged 2 minor accounting irregularities in an unrelated subsidiary that senior auditors had missed entirely. The same quiet, patient thoroughness Adora had spent years teaching her, now finally pointed at something worth protecting, instead of something that had once nearly destroyed her. She never asked Oluwasegun for anything beyond that first conversation. She never leaned on the story that had made her briefly, uncomfortably famous across Lagos business circles. When colleagues asked, carefully, about the woman who'd once been dragged out of the lobby and was now reviewing their department's ledgers, Nancy answered simply, "I got a job on merit. The rest is somebody else's story to tell, not mine." Oluwasegun kept his word about the restitution. Every displaced family from the Apapa relocation received full compensation with 15 years of accumulated interest. A sum large enough that 2 of the families used it to buy the first homes they'd ever owned outright. He attended the handover of the first house himself, standing quietly at the back of a small compound in Ajegunle, while an elderly woman who'd once slept in a relative's parlor for 6 months held the keys to her own front door and wept. 15 years, she told him, gripping his hand, and finally somebody remembered we existed. "I should have remembered sooner," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long." He visited Adora's grave in Port Harcourt alone, 6 months after the board meeting, carrying nothing but the letter she'd left in the folder, which he'd read so many times by then that he'd nearly memorized it. He stood there for a long time in silence, in a modest cemetery far removed from the marble and glass of Alade towers, before finally speaking. "You were right," he said quietly, to a headstone that couldn't answer him back. "About my uncle. About the company. About me, if I'm honest. About exactly what kind of man chooses the easy lie over the hard truth, and calls it loyalty to his family." He placed a single emerald-colored flower at the base of the headstone, the closest he could find, he told the florist, to the shade of the necklace he'd once clasped around her neck. "I let Nancy keep the necklace," he added. "I hope that's all right. I think you'd have wanted her to have something that was actually given with love after everything else she survived." He never remarried again after his second marriage, quietly, mutually dissolved in the year following the scandal. Not out of bitterness between him and Folasade, but because both of them had come to understand, gently and without much drama, that their marriage had been built on the same kind of convenient arrangement his family had built everything else on, and neither of them had the appetite anymore to keep living inside something so carefully constructed and so quietly hollow. Oluwasegun learned 15 years too late that the truth doesn't disappear simply because it's inconvenient to look at. It waits. Sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, and when it finally returns, it rarely announces itself gently. It comes back wearing a stranger's necklace, standing in a lobby you thought you controlled completely. Adora learned, in her final years, that dignity survives even when justice is delayed, that carrying the truth quietly, patiently, and passing it faithfully to someone who could finish what she started was its own kind of victory, even one she never lived to see. And Nancy learned that inheritance isn't only money or property. Sometimes it's a truth someone trusted you to carry, and the discipline to deliver it exactly the way you were asked to, not for revenge, but because some promises are worth keeping, even when you have nothing left of your own. Somewhere in Lagos, a compliance officer at Alade Towers still wears a single emerald necklace to work most days. Not hidden beneath her collar anymore, but in plain sight. A quiet reminder that the truth, however long it's buried, always eventually finds its way home. If this story reminded you that the truth is always worth waiting for, hit subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you'd have done in Oluwasegun's position. And share this with someone who needs to hear tonight that it's never too late to finally look.